All right, welcome back, friends and comrades. Daniel here with two special comrades and guests, Eduardo Cadava, Sara Nadal-Melsió, who I will invite them to introduce themselves in a moment, but we are here to talk about their newly released text, Politically Read, with MIT Press. This is a very kind of, I think, book that transcends the academy and is very much in the spirit of our study group's channel. I really started this podcast coming out of a profound social isolation from the pandemic. I think the book that we're about to talk about has a touchstone point in that global situation that we all experienced in one form or another. This is a book regarding a strategy of reading on the left as Marxists, and it's quite compelling and quite interesting. We're here to talk about this book. Eduardo, Sara, welcome. Thank you for being here. Please, as you wish, just give the listeners, a sense of where you are in the world and what you research, etc. I'll let you introduce yourselves, please, starting with Sara, if you don't mind.
Hello, Daniel, it's a pleasure to be here. It's always good to be amongst comrades. I am basically you could call a recovering academic. I work at the ISP, the Whitney ISP, which is an independent study program for artists and thinkers and critics and curators. My research has always been on the side of Marxism and social movements, but a very unorthodox Marxism. I just finished a book that's coming out with Zone, which is about the European violence in relationship to musical legacies. And it takes the figure of the wolf, which comes from political philosophy and musicology, to try to understand what the relationship between politics and violence is. So this is my last project. Of course, there's also an interest in violence that comes very strongly in Politically Read. So this is what I've just been doing. I've also written a lot about contemporary art, and I've curated, and I've collaborated with other people before, but the longest collaboration I've had has been with Eduardo. It's been an absolute pleasure. And as you very well say, this book is very much the product of a way to resist pandemic isolation and a way to put down the things that keep us going, basically. So it is very much part of that context. I don't know how you feel about that, Eduardo, but I'll just pass it on to you.
Okay. I'd like to just add my thanks to you, Daniel, for inviting us to be here. It's always nice to be able to share one's work and obsessions in some way. I'm a professor at Princeton. I've been at Princeton for over 3 decades. I'm in the English department, but I'm attached to several units across the campus. I work primarily in American, European, Latin American literature, but I also have done a lot of work on history of photography, human rights. I also have done multi-year projects on the relation between political conflict and climate change, and also a project on in Utah at the moment, which is a kind of collaboration among artists, engineers, Navajo communities, on the ruination of the Utah landscape by uranium mining, oil and gas drilling, and the consequences of Native communities. So I'm somebody who is based in the humanities, began in the humanities, but who sees a role in the humanities in addressing all sorts of issues, from human rights to political issues, etc. I have a book on Emerson, a book on Benjamin. I think these are 2 singular but related writers. I do a lot of work on with artists. I collaborate a lot with artists, and especially in human rights contexts. I've done a lot of collaborations, but as Sara said, I think this one has been the most remarkable, unexpected, and consequential collaboration. And I think that one of the things that marked it for me was not simply its basis in conversation, but also, despite the fact that we share, but also come from different archives, there was an absolute complicity about how we move forward politically. And I think this has been one of the most remarkable rewards of the project for me.
I'd actually like to begin before we jump into the text, Politically Read, which everybody really should pick up. And I would even say pick up in physical form, given that the quality of the paper is unlike any quality that I've encountered for a while. It has this bordering, and there's a number of historical archival images and photographs from texts, but from the history of socialism, from communism, littered throughout the book. So it's actually quite beneficial to have this in your library. And I don't mean that as a cheap plug to buy the book, please. I'm literally think that it's beneficial in that regard. But one of the things I think younger people on the left, younger socialist writers and thinkers, whether you're in the academy or whether you're outside of the academy, either way, is the question of writing with an other person. I've done it myself a bit, and it's gone a lot of different ways. And I imagine that you both have had interlocutors that you've written about that probably haven't been as fluid as your relationship. Could you start by saying something regarding your insights into what makes for a certain simpatico? And so, because you see, I'm asking for something quite practical for people, right? And perhaps that's too on the nose, but perhaps also there's something in there that you could generate for us.
Right.
Do you want to start, Sara?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that we both learn is that this question of collaboration is a profoundly political question, and that basically everybody in the archive that we're reading has a sense of being surrounded by others. Probably most of them are the dead. We work with the dead when we are writing all the time. We teach with the dead, but also there's a sense of our collaboration had to do with recovering the risk of thinking with somebody else and thinking with someone else's thoughts and thinking with also someone else's words. We have forgotten that there is a risk, and a risk that's a very good risk, of losing your structural consistency when you work with someone else. So there's this sense of not being completely the owner of your own thinking that puts you in a place of precarity that forces you to think on your feet, which is very much what we admire about the people that we're reading. This sense that nothing is able to fully own. It's not about ownership. You do not own ideas. All you can do is set them into motion. All you can do is make sure that they breathe in and out with other people. So every act of thinking, the way I see it, if it is to be true to the idea of thinking, has to be a conversation. And it has to belong to the logic of doing, of a logic of production, a logic of putting something else out in the world, but never starting from scratch. So what I really loved about, working with Eduardo, what I did learn is that we were forcing each other out of our comfort zones. We always felt a little bit at risk, but the excitement never went away, right? So there was a sense of we were not what we would be separately, and we were not just a simple, combination of the two of us. We were something else, right? It's like we became this hybrid. And I think that is politically very interesting, because what we're trying to say in the book is that any political act is always the effect of a temporary coalition, right? It is never fully identifiable. It is always in flux. It is always precarious. It is always a surprise. It is always emerging, and it is always fragile. So there was something about that basically our conversations were enacting the things that we were talking about. So there was a sense of belonging to the logic of the coalition, and the logic of this heterogeneous kind of collective, this amalgamation of voices that we're constantly talking about. It was not just the two of us in the room; it was a crowd of voices, and it was a matter of listening to them and being affected by them and being undone by them. Right? That's what I talk about, what it means, the risks of reading. We forget that when we read carefully, we're being transformed by what we read. When we have a conversation that's a deep conversation, our sense of self becomes undone. And that's a great thing, right? So I really felt that Eduardo and I we were making each other braver. We were making each other take more risks. We were making each other basically push forward and never stay in an area of comfort. Some of the topics that we touch on are potentially very, they're risky. And we both went for that. And I think it had to do with this absolute belief that the process was the ethos of the book. I mean, that answers your question in some way. And I would love to hear what Eduardo has to say.
I mean, I'll just add a few things because I think you put a lot of it very beautifully. What I'll say is that, I mean, 'cause I also hear a kind of practical element to what Daniel was asking, like almost like how did we even do it, you know? And I think that I said early on that the whole book was based on conversation. You know, the book was originally, I mean, we didn't even imagine a book. I had been invited to do a review of Fred Jameson's book on Benjamin, which had come out in 2020. In fact, was published on Election Day 2020. I don't like doing reviews. I've done very few in my life. I now have come to realize that the fact that we wrote a book instead of just a review is a confirmation that I just can't do reviews. But, you know, I talked to Sara about doing this with me, a review, and then she read the book, we started talking, and then we decided we could do it. So the review is supposed to be 3,000 to 5,000 words. 5 weeks, we had 36,000 words, and then we decided that we would just let it unfold, maybe just write a small political manifesto, and then 18, 20 months later, we had 160,000 words. And I think that practically the way it worked is it was all based on conversation. I just happened to type a little faster than Sara, so I would take notes on our conversation. I would share the notes, we would share them, and then we would start writing, kind of talking, not necessarily planning how it would go. Sara writes more telegraphically than I do, more expansive. She would send me things, I would expand them, I'd send them back, she'd cut them, and then we would read everything out aloud. And I think that this reading aloud was part of the process. It's part of the collaboration. And as she said, what we're trying to argue is that reading and writing are not simply collaborative practices always, but they're essential to how one does politics. You know, that all the figures that we look at, from Marx to Luxembourg to Benjamin to DuBois to Jameson, these are all voracious readers and prolific writers, right? So that their activism, their political activism, is inseparable from a labor of study, reading, and writing. I think this is extremely important for us to understand. The other thing that I'll say too is that we trusted each other. There was a way in which the process of working together allowed us to trust each other, so that, of course, there were disagreements at different moments. But when we would disagree, we would continue to talk with that respect and trust until we found a formulation we could both live with, and then we would move on. You know, so that there was the entire process was, in fact, not just a collaborative process, but it was a process. It was unending. It never stayed fixed. It was never determined in advance. Sara has said, and I think this is true, that if we had planned this book, it never would have happened. And maybe at some point we could talk about how it expanded the way it did, how it got amplified in some way. But I think that the important thing in this collaboration was not just the unpredictability of it, but the kind of growing just absolute trust in each other, so that there was a way in which we would think together, work together. You know, we have different antennas, so we would pick up different details in the text that we were working in. And we each, in some level, trusted each other's instincts, resisted those others' instincts, and also went forward, always working together and thinking about how we could move from there. And we had models from Marx and Engels to other collaborators, right?
Yeah. So. No, it's true. And I'm just going to show this image which appears in the book. You can, if you go to the screen, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see this. This is a manuscript of Karl Marx and Engels' German ideology. In the right-hand margin is Engels' doodlings of a series of faces of the young Hegelians, but they appear almost like the front cover of Thomas Hobbes's The Leviathan, where it's the kind of monarchical figure with all of the multitude inside of the body of the king, right? And of course, we know from Agamben the richness of this metaphor. And so you start off the text with this idea that embedded in the reading approach is a connection to the masses. And I want to open with this notion. Obviously, we have from Hart and Negri the notion of multitude, and from Freud in his analysis of group psychology, and the notion of the masses. And of course, in Marxist study, this category can be quite nebulous, the proletariat. One is always drawn, I think, continuously to this question of the status of the proletariat, the invention of the proletariat, how are we on the left to relate to the masses, etc., etc. Sort of, please speak openly and broadly regarding this question of how you make this very interesting claim that we're always engaging with this sort of conception of the masses, whether that's unconscious even, right? Because you start off the text with this claim, and I really found it quite compelling. And by the way, I shared it on social media, and for whatever reason, it became kind of very popular. The manuscript image, in part because Engels is such a funny person, by the way, that he would be doodling like that. But go on, please.
Can I start with this one, and then you can maybe take the proletariat question, because you're so good with that one. But I just wanted to say something about the frontispiece, some of the image that you just showed. It is a manuscript page from the thesis on Feuerbach. If you look at the page, maybe it was, I think you can see it the way you showed it. People see it the way it is. So on the left is Engels's handwriting. But of course, when Engels writes, whatever he writes is the result of a conversation between him and Marx, right? And so already that activity of writing, that writing is not just his. And so if one were able to blow that image up, what you see on the right, underneath the doodling, are little marks and sentences and fragments, notes by Marx on the left side writing. So his corrections, little notes on what Engels has written. And then Engels does these amazing little doodles of heads within heads within heads, right? And he does this over the course of days, weeks, months. He didn't do it in one sitting. So what you actually are looking at is the slow emergence of a mass through the movement of his pen, which is kind of fantastic for our argument, because we're trying to argue about the role and place of reading and writing within the political sphere. So he's talking about the development of the emergence of a mass in relation to this. And this mass, as you say, it's a kind of it can be a kind of response or reading of the Hobbes Leviathan thing, but in this instance, the mass is not looking at the sovereign; it's looking at a text, and it's looking leftward also. So there's a whole complicated set of things. But in terms of the question of the masses, Emerson, that's a nice slip. Benjamin says at one point that it's always a question of how to set the masses in motion. Or as Brecht says, he cites, the art of thinking politically is the art of thinking your thoughts in other people's heads. Right? So, what we were trying to do is think about, that frontispiece becomes the entry into the book, because it becomes an emblem of collaboration. It becomes an emblem of because what you're witnessing in that frontispiece is, in fact, the process of their production. Right? So that you're seeing the process of their production, the multiple voices that they're bringing to bear on here, because you can actually read what he's written on the left, and it has, if you read it, it has encrypted in it all the main themes of their project to come. Right? So it's an extraordinary little archive. But in terms of the emergence of the mass and the emergence of the proletarian mass, I'll turn it over to Sara, and then if there's anything else I can say,
Can I say one thing very quickly?
Yes.
Very quickly. We just did a study group on the 1844 manuscripts, okay? And I think its thesis on Feuerbach is written like 1 or 2 years later than that, okay?
Yeah.
When Marx, and Engels are under basically house arrest in Belgium, where there really actually is this very interesting connection to the global pandemic.
Yeah.
You see, they wrote this thesis on Feuerbach when the police had already castigated them as revolutionaries, and they were almost in a kind of political exile.
Right.
And if you read Hunt's biography on the political ideas of Marx and Engels, political biography, he argues that the thesis on Feuerbach were not meant to be published because they were so speculative and radical.
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so it's a very interesting connection there. But then, of course, Engels later, after Marx dies, writes a book where he reflects back on the thesis on Feuerbach, and he says, of course, well, we were basically correct, even though we were very young. We were correct in our critique of Feuerbach, because only 1 year prior they said that Feuerbach is the philosopher of modern socialism. But then in 1 year he becomes not an antagonist, but an impediment, an obstacle.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not just that the theses on Feuerbach are radical, but they're totally wild as a set of things, and also it should be said that the German ideology was never a title that they gave to this set of writings, right? This is an editorial edition later, so it's never clear if it was meant to be a book or if it was meant to be notes toward a different project. Right? Yeah, Sara.
But I do think that the thing that is very clear is that what you get there is the infrastructure of the thinking. And that the infrastructure of the thinking may not be fully conscious to them. I think the beautiful thing about the doodle is that there is a process of the unconscious that's also there. So it's almost, and something that I always think about is that the text is smarter than they are. The text is an artifact, an organism that functions on its own as well. And that when they return to the thesis actually had been true to the project. But the project is not just Marx and Engels' project. It is a project that constitutes them through the process of writing. And I think this question of constitution is very important, because what you have in the two columns, as opposed to, say, the Hobbes, is you have a self-constituting mass, a constituting text, and a constituting mass. So they constitute one another. They don't exist separately from one another. And I think that's very important, because what these books argues, as opposed to the question of the proletariat as a subject of history, is that the mass is constituted in its movement. It does not precede the movement. It is the movement that constitutes the mass. And reading and writing are to be understood as movements. Now, that is something that Benjamin says, that Marx says, but the person that says it more clearly is Luxembourg. And I think what's really beautiful about this is that what you end up is there are no political subjects in this book. Right? What you actually have is political movements that create very fragile and finite moments of gathering and amalgamation. The closest we come to having a sort of political subject, which is a non-subject, is the slaves striking for the general strike in DuBois' Black Reconstruction. Why is that? It's because those slaves are not just, they basically are the combination of all the different modalities of capitalism. They are a labor force. They are the general equivalent. They are the commodity. They are everything that you can think about in one entity, right? When they decide to put the tools down, they really undo the system. They undo it from within. So if you were to think about that, and I think that's one of the more, in my opinion, one of the contributions of the book, is that it situates the center, the problematic center that will undo capitalism in this figure, which is profoundly unthought because it remains opaque. So it's almost like it substitutes this sort of programmatic understanding of proletariat, which is constituted by its labor, right? It arrives constituted, to this other figure that is precisely unconstituted, that emerges out of its own disappearance. So it's a much more complicated understanding of how political entities emerge. And I think in that case, it's also about understanding that, say, DuBois' understanding of Marx, which is considered to be profoundly unorthodox and very criticized by Marxists, is actually hitting the nail on the head about the complexity of understanding how a revolutionary mass emerges. And I think what's really beautiful about this is that it basically sort of changes the order of things. It basically throws the subject of the way, right? It actually creates this amorphous form that is powerful only as long as it moves, right? And this is a different kind of model than what we've been seeing. It also means that it is a mass that cannot be forced to move. It will move, and what you can do is join it. And I think that's a problem that Lukács has. Lukács cannot really figure out how do you go from the proletariat to an actual, revolutionary mass. The problem of the standpoint is a problem that he always has. He doesn't know what to do with the intellectual. How is the intellectual going to be part of this? And what Benjamin, Marx, and Luxembourg and DuBois are saying is you're not at the center of the movement, you join the movement.
Mm-hmm.
And when you join the movement, you cease to be an intellectual, you cease to be a philosopher, you cease to be all these other things. You become something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this power of metamorphosis and transformation, which is very painful, right? Because it means letting go of these, identitary uncertainties, letting go of the idea of the subject, letting go of this, knowledge that we carry as cultural capital. It's really, really important. So I think that, to me, is one of the most interesting sort of political corrections to a certain reading of who is the subject of history. As the way we see it, there are no subject of history. That's the point. History has no subject.
Is this generated also from Walter Benjamin as well? And
Yes.
because the bulk of the first half of your text is a serious confrontation with Benjamin's political writings primarily, but you really touch on as you mentioned, Eduardo, is inspired by Jameson's book on the Benjamin Files, which is the sort of a book on a commentary on the entirety of Benjamin's work, right? Could we bring him into the picture here and perhaps isolate his contribution regarding this wider theme? And then I'd like to then revisit Lukács, DuBois, and Marx as well. But perhaps, could we center Benjamin here?
Yeah. I mean, just to follow when I say in the Eduardo is we both basically going back to Benjamin was going back home, but with the course of the moment we're living in, we read Benjamin very differently. So there is a footnote in the second edition of the Work of Art essay where he does talk about the goal being setting the masses into motion, right? Benjamin is a very unorthodox Marxist, and he's very often criticized for that. But he does get that right, and he gets it right in a very interesting way. He always thinks of the setting the masses into motion through the mediation of technology, right? So he's actually thinking of technology as a sort of thing that can be can be used to accelerate this production of the masses, right? And I think that's really something that is often not taken into account. And Eduardo has had a reading for a while of the Work of Art essay that really focuses on the idea of massification. And I think it's a reading that is not maybe completely incompatible with the readings that are out there, but it's a reading that he had and that we expanded upon, taking into account this footnote, right? And I think I would love him to talk more about this because it basically politicizes every one of Benjamin's writings in a way that hasn't been done before. So our understanding of Benjamin is even before Benjamin encounters Marxism, there is a political structure that he continues to use to the end of his life, right? And that political structure may not have the name of Marxism, but it's completely useful to understand the way Marxism works. So basically what we're doing is we're taking these kind of non-orthodox figures to go back to the Marxist archive and to say that precisely because they're reading against the grain, they're getting closer to the kernel of what the Marxist text is proposing in its underground infrastructure, if that makes sense. So because Eduardo is the master of this reading of the Work of Art essay, I'm going to pass it on to him.
Well, I think part of what you're asking, Doc, the sound changed a little bit, but I don't know if you can hear me. But in any case, I think part of your question also was what role the Jameson text played in opening onto this. One of the things was just that I said I rarely do reviews, but because I know Fred, and because he was in his late 80s at this time, it's sort of in the twilight of his life, but also his career. He writes his first book on Benjamin. And he had been writing on Benjamin since the late 60s here and there. And you can actually track the way his reading of Benjamin changes in time, right? But then he writes this book on Benjamin. And, Fred is notoriously convoluted in his writing, etc. This book on Benjamin is stunningly beautiful. It is absolutely gorgeous as a book in its writing, in its language. And I think that part of it is that when you write on Benjamin, and I've had friends who say this too, and I've experienced this myself, you will end up, there's a kind of mimetic contagion you end up writing like Benjamin, you know? And so there's a moment where Fred even registers this, and he says that engaging Benjamin's writing has produced a kind of cultural revolution in the mode of his reading, and that this should be illegal and denounced as such. And it's this kind of gorgeous moment where he registers the precarity of reading in general, but of his reading of Benjamin in particular. And I think that what happened is that we got sort of seduced almost by the writing of Jameson, of the Benjamin. But of course, he's a Marxist reading Benjamin. And he's using Benjamin as a kind of comrade on the shelf to do political work and to think about how to do politics. And I don't know, there was this moment, this is a moment we could talk about later at more length, especially if you want to go to the DuBois and the Luxembourg, etc. But there's a moment when Fred is talking about the withdrawal of revolutions in the 1920s and the expansion of American commodification and capitalism around the globe, and capital is winning because capital is able to bribe the workers. And he says, and this is how Lenin explained the workers voting for Hitler in 1932. And then he says, and this could be also an answer to the hoary question of why there's never been socialism in America. And then in parenthesis, and Sara picked this up with her antennas, he says, perhaps the better answer is race. And he doesn't say anything. So we hop on that little detail because, of course, if we're reading this book in the aftermath of 2020, the word race jumps out, right? And so it's also how a book that you read that isn't necessarily addressing a contemporary moment explicitly can be used as a resource to talk about the contemporary moment, right? So you have him evoking Benjamin at this particular moment, but then we engage it around this little parenthesis, and all of a sudden we're to Werner Sombart's book, Why is There No Social in the United States? Sombart with Max Weber edits a journal that publishes an essay by DuBois, The Problem of the Negro in the U.S., so all of a sudden we're in the DuBois archive, and then we're reading Black Reconstruction as a book that comes to you in the form of a general strike. So what happens is that because a Marxist, let's say a recognizable Marxist, a proclaimed Marxist, is reading Benjamin, you're reading Benjamin in a different context, and little by little, as you start expanding the archives, you start registering. I mean, when I've been reading Benjamin for decades, and one of the things I registered more in this round is how profoundly Marxist he is. Like, what an amazing reader of Marx he is, precisely because he's an unorthodox reader, as is DuBois, as is Luxembourg in her own way. And as is Jameson. I mean, Jameson gets little details wrong here and there, but in general, what he's attuned to, and I think what all these writers are attuned to, is the literary character of Marx's writings. The way in which literature, imagination, all these things play a central role in his political activism. And I think that this is one of the things that we're able to draw out of the reading of this. But I think that the Benjamin, what we show is that Benjamin is read from the very beginning, which is and we can say more about the reading of Benjamin's encounter with Luxembourg, which one reader has said is the heartbeat of the book in some way. But I think that it's also linked very much to a general reflection across the book on the general strike, on the possibility of a general strike. And in some way, we'd like to imagine our book as a book that comes to you in the form of a general strike.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, on the concept of history, Benjamin's text plays a major role in this thinking regarding revolution as what Benjamin calls a tiger's leap, and revolution as something that is also in defiance to the ruling class. And there's also this question of class that comes up in Benjamin, and you all link that to the Floyd uprising, but then create a kind of genealogical through line back to Du Bois's Black Reconstruction.
Right.
And That's very useful, and it's very helpful. And it is, of course, interesting that we're shifting from the compromises of the German working class in the 20s to the question of revolution in the American context, and we're pinpointing DuBois as a kind of, I don't know, prophetic figure regarding the understanding of that conjuncture.
Right.
And I definitely want to invite you to say something about this, in the sense also that Benjamin, in a certain way, says that revolution, he has a phrase, is kind of putting the emergency brake on, pulling the emergency brake
Mhm.
on the train.
Mhm.
And therefore, it's a question of progress, and there is a question of a critique of what you might call, in a fancy sense, teleological Marxism that relies on the theory of progress.
Right.
And that's actually something that is a big, interesting debate that I think maybe this will be my question for you, which is, are we to understand Benjamin also, right, in a broader assault on a Stalinist idea of progress, which itself understands revolution in relationship to perhaps a certain static idea of the working class, and then B, as mechanistically building on bourgeois progress. Um, do you see Benjamin, and this is a question of course, I don't know Benjamin as well as both of you, so it's a clarification question. Is he sort of saying there that, yes, in fact, this is not congruent with Marx's understanding of revolution?
Yeah.
Please.
Mm.
Is that
No, I
clear?
do
Does
think
that
that
make
this idea. I think
It
so.
is.
I
It
think
is.
so. I think it is. I think this question of putting the brakes on is absolutely essential, because what he's always saying is that the revolution, if it's going to be anything, it's going to be an interruption. It's going to be a leap, and it's going to be a leap into the unknown. So the idea that you can program or rely on progress to come about for a socialist or communist society to come about is completely anathema to him. But the funny thing is that this is not anathema to Benjamin; it's anathema to Marx. That's what he basically uncovers, right? That Marx actually never says that. And what's really beautiful about this is that what you actually have with this idea of the interruption, what you have is the idea of the surprise, the unknown, but also this idea that the temporality of the revolution is not a temporality that we could possibly recognize. If you think about all the messianism in Benjamin, it's actually about an attempt to think of a temporality that is exterior to the guild nexus of capitalism, right? So capitalism and religion go together for both Marx and Benjamin. And one of the things that it does is that it creates this kind of idea of guilt or debt in which both the future and the past have already been foreclosed. So basically, temporality is the thing that capitalism attacks more successfully, right? Not just because of the working day, but also because of the way in which it affects the thinking of a future, right? Because the future is already indebted because of the guild nexus. So I think what's really beautiful about them is that they see revolution as the emergence of a different kind of temporality. And I think that has enormous consequences, not just politically, but also philosophically. You could even say almost ontologically. So I think that is something that kind of has not been emphasized enough. And when you think about for instance, the fact that what Marx recognizes as the most important event of the 19th century, and he says it explicitly, is the slaves' uprising, the general strike. He's completely looking at the United States. He's obsessed with what's happening here. He knows it in and out. He reads 14 papers every day. He knows about the Bolivar uprising. He knows about the raid of the ferries. He knows about the Kansas vote. He's teaching himself all these things about American law. And his idea is that this is the crux of what a revolution would look like, right? It would come completely unplanned. It would have no rational explanation. Nobody would even know how it happened. And DuBois picks up on that. He writes this 700-page book on Black Reconstruction, which is about the agency of the Black slaves in emancipation. Well, when he comes to the general strike, which is the event that basically anchors the entire book, he does it in 5 pages because there is no description, there is no witnesses, and there is no understanding of how it happened. How do thousands of slaves all of a sudden, he says it this way, decide that they are free and put the tools down? That is what a revolution looks like. It's an absolute surprise. It's a mass movement, and it does not belong to any of the logics that we have in place. That's what a tiger leap, look. And the notion of the leap is one that he takes from the letters in Marx. Marx actually, he says tiger, I think Marx says lion. But basically, sometimes you find these phrases in Benjamin that are very specific, and then you go back to Marx and you realize that that's where he's taken them from. And it's kind of beautiful, but also there's a sort of a fealty to the Marxist project through the language of it. So I think this is something that was really, really important for us. And it really speaks to the things you're talking about. It is not a Marxism that has any program. It is not a Marxism that would be recognizable at the moment of the revolution. If you think about it, Marx and Engels were surprised by absolutely any revolution. The Commune, 48. Luxembourg was not ready for the German Revolution. She just joined. Mm-hmm. They were never the leaders of anything. They just recognized it, and not immediately, recognized it as it happened, and began to understand that that's what it would look like. So, but the first moment was a complete opacity, and that we have no parameters to recognize how that would look like. And that's what I say. This is a risky business. Politics is risky. It's about jumping into the unknown. It's about not having any guarantees. And they all insist on that, right? And I think that is something that traditional Marxism has had a lot of trouble grappling with, because it is not comfortable. It's a very risky situation. It doesn't allow you to come up with programs, right? So in that sense, a state communism is completely on the antipodes of all this. But I think it's very important.
Let me just very quickly. Go ahead.
No, it's okay.
I just want to very quickly just reinforce the unpredictability of it all. Marx very famously, in a letter to Edward Beazley in the late 1860s, says that anyone who drafts a program for the future is a reactionary. Right? So that according to what Sara is saying is that it's not something that can be planned. It can't be programmed. And this is, the DuBois does this, the Luxembourg does this, Marx does this, Benjamin does it. It all emerges through a process. It's not that the party decides, let's go on strike. It comes disorganized, unorganized, unplanned, emerges. And I'll just give you the one little example that was kind of at the heart of our book, because I think that the shortest section in our book is the section on the George Floyd video. And it was a way of replicating what DuBois does in the section that Sara referenced, where the whole book of Black Reconstruction is organized around the general strike, which everybody says is his misuse of the term, because it's not the party deciding, it's coming from below, it's coming unplanned, disorganized, and all of a sudden you have this flood of illiterate slaves. He makes a point of saying they're illiterate, but they're reading the signs of where the winds of history are going and where the wind of freedom is blowing from. And they put down their tools, join the Northern Army, and this is what turns the war. Right? So he wants to talk about that agency of Blacks in that moment. That's why it's a Black Reconstruction. But when they arrive on the other side, and Sara signaled this, when they arrive on the other side, they're left to read what DuBois says, the Kabbalistic letters of what happened. They arrive on the other side and they don't understand how they got there. Right? But if you think that at the kernel, at the core of the book is also all having lived through 2020, and reading Jameson's book in the aftermath of 2020, and writing this book in the aftermath of 2020, during the pandemic, etc., what you see is that at some point, because Jameson does begin with this figure of the dialectician trying to set the sails so that they take advantage of the wind of world history, what is it in 2020 that was able to be aligned for these demonstrations to just emerge? Right, which were very often unplanned, unorganized, and just emerged and created a kind of global movement, right? And it was a combination of things, right? It was the rage against Trump. It was the Black Lives Matter movement. It was the murder of George Floyd. It was the pandemic. It was communal despair. And out of that communal despair, something happened. Right? But if you think of that image of the dialectician trying to set the sails so that they can take advantage of the wind of history, the wind is blowing, he's on the boat, it's shaking. I mean, the chances that he can align those sails to take advantage are very slim and fleeting. And when that moment happens, he has to be absolutely prepared or that moment goes. Right? It just goes. And that preparation comes from this labor of reading, study, writing, and engaging what we're calling the comrades on the shelf as resources for doing political work.
Yes. Incredible. And I think you talk a lot about the Ship of Fools, which
is one of Sara's favorite sections.
But just a quick little story about the Ship of Fools. You may remember in Madness and Civilization, Foucault's dissertation. He makes this really interesting story about the Ship of Fools at the moment of the birth of capitalism. You may remember this, where it functioned in European society as a spiritual emblem or symbol, because the Ship of Fools basically took cast off people, not only people that are mad or sick or degenerate or criminals, or it was actually a wider class of people than just that. It was also people unable to work. Okay, for people with disabilities. They were thrown onto a ship, and then in Foucault says that in like Cervantes and in Shakespeare, you see references to the Ship of Fools coming back into port, and the people, the masses, the laborers, okay, in Europe, actually celebrated them as a mystique, as like, oh wow, because they're, and then he says this incredible thing, which is it has a correlation as to why in European societies, in dream symbolism, often dreams of madness are associated with water. I don't know if you remember that, but it's such a beautiful thing. Anyways, I have a question here about what in Marxism is called dictatorship of proletariat. And DuBois talks about this, okay? And everybody has to, because we know in a letter that Marx wrote to a Union general, Wedemeyer, okay? And Alain Badiou says this in his book on communism as well, okay? You're probably familiar with this letter, right? Wedemeyer says, look, Marx, what's your most important idea in your country? And Marx says, well, the bourgeois political economists had already developed the idea of class struggle. It was not my idea, although that's an important one. But my biggest contribution has more to do with dictatorship of proletariat. And that's a very, very powerful idea. Then because, of course, it requires us to think the status of this category as a concept in a historicist way, because every situation has its own political economic dynamics. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts on that? I think this concept does come up in your text. Perhaps we might say what Benjamin might contribute to this concept, and perhaps what DuBois might contribute to this concept, and how you all might parse this concept in our present. I know that's a big question. Pardon me if it's too big. What might you say, though?
Go ahead. Go ahead, because I know that you've thought about this. So.
Well, what I do think is that dictatorship of proletariat actually names something that we don't know what it is. Basically, that it names a blind spot in the theory of Marxism. And that then the nomenclature itself, it is actually very striking precisely because of that. It stands out. It seems to mean something very, very precise. But in fact, we've never seen it. We've never seen it, and we do not know what it looks like. And that, to me, recalls the moment where Blanqui says, you all fight against communism, but you have no idea what it is like because it has never existed. So I do think that that is something that's at the core of the Marxian project. There's an unruliness and a sort of a refusal to describe certain moments of the revolution, because describing them, as Eduardo was saying with the letter to Beasley, would actually be to betray them. So to me, that's one of those concepts. It is a concept that names something that we have never experienced, that we have to be prepared for, and we only see it when it emerges, but we do not know what form it will take. And that is actually an essential figure in understanding of the unruliness of Marx as a thinker, right? There is a lot of, he writes a lot, but he refuses to clarify a lot. There's a lot of refusal in his writing. His own writing contains a general strike in a sense. And I think there is something about his understanding that the Marxist project does not belong to him, that Marx is not the name of a subject, it's the name of a sort of collective amalgamation of ideas, and that it is an unfinished project. The Marxist that we're reading here is a Marx that to the end of his life is trying to go into ancient societies to try to find other models for communal associations. Those could be models for the dictatorship proletariat. We do not know that, right? So the idea that Marx knows what that would look like is a total betrayal of the principle of the tiger's leap of the revolution. And I think the fact that this is one of the concepts that has been used most often to close off the energy of Marxism as a movement is very telling. And I think that happens a lot with Marx. This idea that it has to become a sort of a corpus that's somewhat prescriptive, and it is a corpus that is set. What is very clear, and that is more clear even with Marx than with Engels, is that he never thought that his project was finished. He never finished the project of Marxism because he himself could not do it. The whole point is about creating a coalition that will continue this project and will change it and add to it throughout time. So I think that the question that you're asking is one of the questions is very similar to the question that he gets from Vera Sasulic at the end of his life regarding the Russian commune, right? Is this idea that people are having at that time, Marxism has already been reified in Russia. There's already people saying you're not orthodox enough. Marx himself was not an orthodox Marxist, and he would have never been surprised. I don't think he would have been surprised for a second that his name had become the name of some sort of a, had become instrumentalized into the name of a sort of party or movement, because that's not what he's talking about. So I do think that all of these concepts are actually almost like prompts to think about what that might look like, and prompts to understand that we do not know what the communism or Marxism they're talking about is, because it has never existed. And I think that's an absolutely key idea to understand. That's why I think that these kind of like endless discussions about what that might mean or might not mean are actually the problem that we have with engaging with the open and unruly nature of the Marxist project. Mm-hmm. That is a problem that we've had for a century now, right? The fact that we haven't read all of his texts, mm-hmm. that the ethnological notebooks were not published, the mathematical notebooks are not published. Mm. There's so much of texts that Marx read that we are not considering part of his work, right? So it's almost like we zoom in into things that have been instrumentalized politically, where we forget that the movement of his text is much more radical than that, mm-hmm. right? It is about the unsettling of the given. It is not about the production of certainty. It is about the production of more uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And I think Eduardo was pointing at something when he was saying that he was talking about communal despair, right? And all of the writers that we engage on insist that it is at the moment of hopelessness that hope may emerge. It is at the moment of withdrawal of certainty. It is at the moment of absolute decay of ideology that you begin to get a glimpse of what might be, right? And I think Marx is not like that. Marx is always like waiting for something to collapse, because that's when something may be able to happen, right?
Exactly.
So I do think that
I totally agree.
I mean,
that's his reading. That's his reading of the Paris Commune. It's like there's this wonderful.
It's exactly that.
Yes, because Isabelle Garot, a great French communist philosopher, has in her new text "Communism and Strategy." I don't know if you've seen it or read it yet, but she provides a really beautiful analysis of what Marx means by dictatorship of proletariat, precisely as, and it actually paradoxically relates to our present in the sense that one of the things that Marx realized upon witnessing the Commune, was that the working class, the eviscerated proletarian class at the time, experienced the expansion of immediate seizure of the governmental apparatus in an emergency situation, but dialectically they experienced leisure time because they were afforded this by virtue of participating in the revolution. And I always thought to myself, one of the unknown dynamics of what the pandemic did to workers across the world was actually gave them a break from labor in some, not in all cases, but in some. That was a very interesting fact because Marx became very obsessed with this idea of leisure and communism as leisure after the commune, precisely. And even Garo says something very interesting, which is, it is at this point that political knowledge and political ideals are capable of a new form of leadership that would rival existing bourgeois leadership, but only after a revolutionary moment occurs. So a revolutionary moment opens up the question of leisure time for the exploited. So, I'm sorry.
I think that's really beautiful.
Go on, Eduardo.
I just want to put a little parenthesis, a little addendum to what Sara was saying, is that, and bring it to an earlier question that you had, because I think that the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat is a concept that belongs to a modality of progress, right? So I think this would be, that moment would be presumably a moment of progress, etc. So that Benjamin, Luxembourg, Marx are going to be suspicious of that. So it's not about, it's really, again, it's not even, as Sara said, that you only know it when it happens. You only see it when it happens. You don't even see it when it happens. That's why you arrive on the other side of it having happened, and you have to then read the Kabbalistic letters of what happened, right? I mean, that we can't, I mean, again, it's I wrote this in a discussion once with Badiou, it was moderated by Bastiles, and Badiou was arguing for the emergence of new political collectivities that were nameable, identifiable, etc. And I was talking about the emergence of new political collectivities that are unnameable, unidentifiable, etc. And I think this is exactly where we are, and what our difference is from that discourse on the dictatorship of the proletariat. These are collectivities, coalitions that don't yet have a name, and that can't be planned or programmed, and they gather their force in ways that are absolutely unpredictable. And that's part of what, in the midst of all the uncertainty, there is a strength that comes from that. And I think that this is something that's extremely important. And I think Sara explained it all quite nicely. I just wanted to add that little, kind of link the idea of the dictatorship proletariat to a belief in progress. Because that would itself cast suspicion of the concept.
Go ahead, Sara, please. Yeah.
I wanted to go back because it actually connects to it with your mentioning of the Paris Commune and the question of the way that Marx talks about it. Because I think the most piercing critique that Marx gets in his lifetime is the one that Paul Lafort comes out to it when he says he writes a right to laziness. Because in that book, precisely because of the experience of the Paris Commune, he attacks the category of the worker. He says, why is it that we have to identify with just being workers? Why can we not identify with our right to laziness, with our leisure time? And I think that's something that Marx picks up. And he realizes that is a genuine critique, right? Because it basically, again, it gets him out of his identitarian logic, whether it's a subject of history. And it is the moment that you stop being a worker through leisure that you may become a revolutionary subject. And I think Claire Demar for Benjamin, Lafort for Marx. And these are people who are pointing at the problem with any moment in their theories where they could be instrumentalized as having a political program. And I think that Commune does teach Marx that. And I think when you bring out the question of time and leisure is absolutely important. And Marx knows from the beginning that it all hinges on the question of time and how we experience time, right? That it is the form of the revolution is a temporal form. And that's something that everybody here agrees with in our book, right? That it has to do with a particular understanding of time that is much more impure, is much more mediated, is multi-temporal. It includes the living and the dead, the ones who are not here yet. So it's a much broader coalition where basically it's not about excluding, but about endlessly including, right? So it is amorphous precisely because it's not exclusionary and it's not identitarian. So I think these are also really important points. And I just remembered like how relevant I think that the Lafort correction is, right? And the same thing happens with Demar and Benjamin when Demar basically shows him that patronymics and the logic of the family are absolutely essential for the perpetuation of the status quo. And that thing that has to go away, right? And he learns that from her. Also, another revolutionary from the Paris Commune.
That makes sense. Thank you very much. I mean, this is very rich, and I bring people onto my channel who have all kinds of different perspectives, and this is fabulous. One question I had is, with Benjamin's conception of the Messianic, with his conception of temporality and time, and in his re-theorization of revolution, in light of all of that, the kind of common sense, or maybe we could say intuitive distinction between anarchism and communism seems to dissolve. Does it not? Does it not? Tell me, what do you think? I know it's a very basic question, but it seems like I don't see the difference. Does that make sense?
I think
or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, it makes perfect sense. If I were to say, and this is something that's not in the book, if I were to say that there is a difference, is that the difference with communism is anarchism that will not say its name, right? It's basically there's something a communist might say, there's a certain arrogance about anarchism, the idea that this is actually possible and that you can imagine it, right? It's almost about like this idea that anarchism is putting the eggs before the chicken, that there's something about anarchism that has a certain arrogance to it. Is that that it makes this absence of a state and absence of government a premise, whereas in communism this will happen organically, right? So I think that is the difference. It's a programmatic difference. It's not a difference. The results might be the same, but the relationship to the program is different, and I think that's important. And I do think at the moments of revolution, and that is 71. It's also the first year of the Spanish Civil War. They're very often impossible to tell apart, but they will differentiate one another because they will adhere to a program. So the result will be the same, but the identification to the program will separate them. And I think that's one of the dangers of the program that Marx points out constantly, right? So
I would say it's not
I'm thinking about it. Yeah.
It's not just a question of a program. It's also a question of a stronger belief in the agency of the subject. And I think that, this would require a longer elaboration. So just very telegraphically say that a lot of this comes up in our reading of Benjamin's Critique of Violence essay, because in that essay, he evokes George Sorel as his, let's say, interlocutor to talk about the difference between the general strike and the general political strike and the general proletarian strike. And Sorel was an anarcho-syndicalist, right? So he uses him, and our argument is in fact that this is an encrypted engagement with Rosa Luxembourg, right? So that I don't want to go into the whole reading, but the reading is in part a way of pitting communism against anarchism in that essay, and so that there is a relay, because there is a relay. Sorel's also reading Luxembourg, but Benjamin is mobilizing Luxembourg against Sorel, precisely around the issue of identification, programming, agency, etc. But just telegraphically for people who are listening, I mean, the argument in that is that the Critique of Violence is an essay that is entirely organized around the missing body of Rosa Luxembourg. And so there's this question of why Benjamin encrypts Rosa, doesn't name her, and again, it's linked to what Sara is saying. It's not about subjects, it's about movements, and it's about the Spartacists, who is Spartacists are a particular reference throughout Benjamin's corpus. Benjamin's brother was a Spartacist. Anyway, there's a whole reading there that I don't know that we have time to get into, but the main point would be that is a site within the book where one can track this question of the relation, but also the difference between anarchism and communism in the pitting against Luxembourg against Sorel.
That's very helpful. Yeah,
that's a very good place. Yeah,
it's a good point. I mean, it does merit its own podcast or its own point of conversation, because, of course, I have mentioned on my program the dangers of Sorel, and of course, Mussolini was a Sorelian. Fundamentally, because Sorel basically says, well, we don't overthrow the capitalist class. We overthrow the kind of cultural intelligentsia, right? So it's a kind of anti-elitist populism, which has abandoned all commitment to a rational understanding of revolutionizing capitalism. So capitalism doesn't go away.
And it's also extremely masculinist.
No.
Very masculinist.
It's masculinist.
Yeah.
It's militaristic. It goes into Valois in France. It becomes a proto-fascist movement. It has to do with mythical history. It has to do with the erection of myths. It has this aestheticist bent to it, which is very important. You know, all of the people we're talking about anti-aestheticist. So there's absolutely a relay there. And I think that's a danger that Benjamin sees when he's writing The Critique of Violence, and then eventually he interviews Valois in France, and he does mention that Valois has a revolver on the table, and that to him is a sign that that is the logical consequence of anarcho-syndicalism. This is a very beautiful interview that he does.
Right. And it's also important to say, and I say this as somebody who has a book out as a critique of Nietzsche, Sorel also has to be read by Marxists, just like Nietzsche does, because you could walk away.
Absolutely.
You could walk away and say, well, Nietzsche influenced Mussolini, Sorel influenced Mussolini, so let's abandon them.
Right.
That's not what I say. But nonetheless, you still need to be really critical with them. Let's say, okay. That's another topic. So let's now move, if we could.
But very quickly, it's an important topic because Benjamin often reads figures that are complicit with what he thinks goes in the direction of the worst. From Junger to Valois to Sorel, because even Schubert, can have these elements within it. Yeah. So there's a way in which he's not oppositional. He really gets into a text and sees the resources, even within text, that can go in other directions. So he's one of the great analysts of the possibility and almost inevitability of political complicity, which is very technical for him. It's a very technical term for him. The term danger for Benjamin is exactly that. It's the always present possibility that without your knowing it, you can become a tool of the oppressors. Right? And that's why you need these strategies for reading, for engaging, for inhabiting the very language that you want to go against, even knowing that the moment you do that, you run the risk always, or without your knowing it, reinforcing what you're trying to go against.
Fabulous.
And it's also the thing that the answer is never do not read. The answer is read your enemy, understand the mechanisms, go deep into it so that you can actually counteract it. So the answer is never we do not read this. It is we read it and we just go in there and try to throw a wrench into it. So,
Marx is one of the great readers of Capital. He's one of the great readers of capitalism.
That's exactly
I remember Lukács, because the Soviets under Stalin did have a rigidity about reading reactionaries, and Lukács says that all changed when this is very funny actually. Engels wrote in a letter which was later released during the Stalinist time, and the intellectuals got access to it. And you know what Engels said? He said, Balzac is brilliant, and Balzac is this crazy aristocratic reactionary, but man, he's got a great critique of capitalism. Yeah. And Lukács says at that point, the Soviets allowed reactionaries to be read.
Yeah.
So I mean, Marx wanted to write on Balzac. Yeah.
Well, you see my point though. Like bless the Stalinists to a certain extent, because what's the impulse for them? The impulse is purity. It's not purity is not necessarily a bad thing at face value. You have to understand why they're puritanical. They're trying to protect something, right? What are they trying to protect? So that's my thing on the left, is like, we have to have a sort of psychoanalytic sensitivity to these different interpretations, and not allow people to get so, and I think this is what the pandemic has also allowed, a certain acerbic lack of comradeship. And I feel like your text is an invitation to be more comradely to each other.
Right.
Even in these distinctions between anarchism and communism, some people would say, I'm leaving this conversation because of what you said, or something like this. Like, I really don't, that's not the spirit of my views, and I don't think it's yours either. But
it's not the spirit of any of the people we read either.
Sorry? Say again?
It's not the spirit of any of the people we read in the book either.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Because we are, I mean, what did Lenin say about the unity of Marxists? right? All of your critiques of Lenin, he's right about the importance of the unity of Marxists in any political conjuncture, in my opinion. Which, yeah, okay, there's much to be said, but I'm trying to steer this conversation in a certain way, and I have a really big interest in helping you to elaborate, if you would, on Benjamin's theory of back to his theory of revolution and time, if we could, because it's such a big theme in your book. Okay, how might on the concept of history? Okay, can we revisit this? And could you perhaps open it up a little bit more for us, especially about the beautiful debate on the Angelus Novus, on the famous iconic symbol, which we all now associate with Benjamin, the painting by Klee, right? What's the story perhaps with the Messianic in Western Marxism? We know that Lukács is appealed to the Messianic. We know that many people in Western Marxism, Benjamin's not the only one that's interested in this. What is the meaning of the Messianic for Benjamin? Perhaps might be one place to start. I know this is an immense topic, but can you help us unpack it? Sarah, would you like to begin?
Yeah.
Sure. I was thinking like the Angelus Novus has a big role here, and it is partly because we read it differently. So the Angelus Novus is the clay painting that accompanies Benjamin his entire life. So he's probably looking at it quite a bit. He knows clay, he knows how it's been produced. So what we use the research of Quakeman, an artist that had done X-rays of the painting and had discovered that behind it, and we actually see it very clearly, it's a very small painting in the Israel Museum, and you see a kind of the sort of it allows you to see that there's something underneath the painting. So she discovered that there is actually a portrait of Luther by Grana. And to us, this was a sort of a kind of a clue into understanding the image, not so much as an image, but as a sort of as a box or an archive, as something that had an inside and had layers and contained a number of elements within it. And we decided to read that temporally, right? So the temporality of the painting seems to be like, there's a backwards and a forwards. There's like looking into the ruins of the past being thrown into the future. But there's something that the fact that Benjamin knows that there's something underneath this painting that contains another number of theses, which is a thesis by Luther. So what you actually get is a much more complex understanding of temporality. It is a temporality that includes all the previous ones, that it moves in multiple directions, and it is not a temporality that can be fully controlled. So you actually get is temporality. Yeah, that's the image. As a sort of, as the almost, you would say it's almost the thing that the revolution is made out of. It is about seizing time as something that is a matter of a coalition, heterogeneity, multiplicity, amalgamation, organistic understanding of this a topological unfolding of temporality that has revolutionary consequences. And the image that basically parallels this in our text is the mural of George Floyd with the wings, right? We decided to make that very, very short because it is such a powerful image that it should remain almost like condensed. It is the condensed point that articulates the entire text, but we don't want to instrumentalize it. But that image is an image of temporality. One of the things that George Floyd, we read the George Floyd video in a Benjaminian way. It is a temporality that contains everything that came before. It is the image that is asked to carry a weight that no image should ever carry. It is an image that contains a history of anti-Black violence. It is an image that contains the violence of capitalism. It is an image that its duration itself makes it revolutionary. And it's a duration that is not about its extension in time, it's the depth of the image. The image contains other bodies that have been sacrificed to this sacrificial understanding of history. So I think that's where you can use the Benjaminian logic to read images that have that kind of depth built into them. The image of Floyd is an image that we will never be able to fully unfold because it keeps growing and growing and growing because it contains multitudes. When Kadir Nelson does a rewrite of the image for the cover of the New Yorker, he transforms it into, again, a Leviathan. A Leviathan with the body of Floyd contains the entirety of the middle passage of the Black radical the Black radical tradition, and of everything that will come after. So that is the logic of the revolutionary time. It is a revolutionary time that is expanding so much that it can contain everything. And that is something that Benjamin calls Messianic. Why? Because Messianic would be something that we have never experienced. It is the Messianic of the Jewish tradition, right? It is a Messiah that is not a Messiah, right? It is a Messiah that is precisely the blind spot of temporality. It is a temporality that can be everything because it is nothing. So the negativity of the Messianic temporality is what allows the space for this temporality that will be occupied by the revolution. And it's an infinitely complex temporality that is basically, I'm going to sound a crazy thing, it's like the atomic bomb, right? It is this small nucleus that will expand endlessly, right? It has this force of condensation. And it's in a way uncontrollable. That is, again, the danger of it, right? Nobody can control this explosive force. So there's something about these images, the angel and the image, the Floyd, these are detonations. These are revolutionary detonations that work in an explosive way. And that is the form of revolutionary temporality. And I'm trying to be very condensed because this is a very difficult topic. And we do touch in the book, of course, we are much more extensive. We have time to explain things. But this is basically the underlying structure. And I wonder if Eduardo has...
Well, I'll just formalize very quickly because I think Sara has said a lot here, that Messianism and Benjamin can't be thought in relation to what Messianism has traditionally been thought within religious, philosophical, political discourse, where it's usually associated with a transcendence of history, with what's outside of time or in the future, and with the affirmation of a determinate messianic or messiah figure. Right? It has to be considered what we call a finite messianism, right? Which is to say, it's a historical event that even if it can never be reduced to a concept, to a historical context, it interrupts history. It's a structural feature of historical existence. And in fact, Benjamin says that it's a conception of the present as now time that is shot through with splinters of messianic time, right? This is what he says. So there's no moment for Benjamin that isn't shot through by the messianic. You know, so it's not a moment that is in the future, that's to come. It's because the messianic is not a negation of time. It's a differential structure of time that is in and as history. And so it names a structure of experience that can't be reduced to any kind of religious messianism, Jewish, Christian, etc., or to any recognizable utopianism. Right. So the figure of the Messiah, as Sara suggests, it's a figure of something that is coming. It's the coming of an indeterminate, unpredictable, irreducibly heterogeneous future that would not arrive with a Messiah. I mean, the Messiah never arrives, and if it arrives, as Kafka says, it's too late. It always comes a day after when it's supposed to come, right? So the Messiah becomes a figure within Benjamin for, one of the many figures that we've been talking about. The Messiah is linked to a temporality that is in time at the same time that it exceeds any kind of temporal model that we have, which is why, again, it comes as something that is unpredictable, indeterminate, and unable to be named or even be registered when it happens. Right. And I'd only add as a detail that the figure of the Floyd is the figure of the angel, which we all saw. Those wings are the classic pose for the black man who's about to be arrested.
Right.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, and I'll put this on the screen in the video edit so folks can see it. One passage in Jameson's book, The Benjamin Files, that you quote is something along the lines of an offhand remark that he makes, which is the way that Benjamin related to the painting is that this angel represents the awkward Benjamin himself. I posted this on social media, and Benjamin scholars were upset that Jameson said this. So I wanted to offer a chance for either of you to defend that comment. Perhaps it's a very minuscule comment at the end of the day, but what did Jameson mean by that? And then you talk about awkward and the meaning of Messianic time and revolution as itself in an awkward positionality, and Benjamin perhaps is an awkward intellectual. I don't know. What's the meaning of that, though?
Go to it, Sara. It's the etymological meaning of the word awkward.
Yeah. No, I think it's philologically correct. What he's trying to do is to try to understand that the awkwardness of the image is the way in which Benjamin is always looking at things against the grain and going array. So it is about this, basically, he goes in directions that you would not expect, right? And I think in that sense, the awkward has to be understood philologically and literally. So what he's actually pointing out is the multidirectionality of Benjaminian's relationship to the image, which is precisely what he does when he reads the image temporally, right? It is not something that we can understand in a linear way. It's completely scrambled. That is the awkwardness. And I think that's what he's doing. In a way, at some points, he does have this kind of philological games in the book. We already talked about how this book is more writerly than other of Jameson's book. It is also a book that relies on the figure of the philologist in a way that I haven't seen him do before. So it's almost like he lets the language lead the way. And it's a language that is not his, that he's borrowed. And he resists this language, but at the same time, he embraces it because it opens new readings of Benjamin. And you see him doing that when he describes the painting. So it's actually a very good example of what's different about this book that Jameson writes at the end of his life. Eduardo.
And the word upward has word in it, which has to do with movement, right? Backward, forward, upward. It's a root that has to do with movement. Right?
Yeah.
It's not. In other words, it's not an anthropomorphizing of the angel as Benjamin himself. That's not what's to be understood. It's.
In fact, we don't see the angel as human at all. We see the angel as a sort of technological, hybrid, if anything. So,
and if anything, Benjamin as an interpreter of revolutionary history, as an interpreter of Messianic time, is not to be literalized as he embodies it or some kind of. It's not a grandiose thing. Yeah.
But what's also interesting, of course, if you think of the Quaitman, the discovery that behind the clay image is in fact this copper engraving of Luther, right? Not just anyone, but Luther, right? Who wrote in theses like Benjamin, right? And so you have this thing where in the description that Benjamin gives of the image, the angel of history is looking at the ruins of the past and his back is toward the future because, of course, you cannot see or predict the future. But in the materiality of the object, the back of the angel is looking, if it's looking at anything, at processes of reproduction. Copper engraving, which itself is based on a painting by Cranach in the 1520s. So the future are techniques of reproduction. It's kind of this fabulous kind of emblem of a different kind of thinking of time.
Well, it would also make more sense if the figure behind the representation of the awkward angel were to be Münzer, not Luther. That would make more sense to me because we're right. I mean, we're aware in the time that Luther was the moderate. I mean, Engels says this in his book on the Peasants' War, right? Luther was basically the bourgeois compromise position. The true proletarian revolutionary was Münzer. So that's
Of course, it's interesting that Luther, though, given his iconoclasm, is friends with Cranach, illustrates some of his books with some of Cranach's illustrations. So it's a kind of, again, it's a figure that can't be identified with a single political stance, right? And I think this is
Right. You know,
and Luther is a kind of model for Benjamin in terms of the theses. This has been discussed before
right.
in terms of the mode of writing. Yeah.
Yeah, and also in terms of what would be more appropriate is interesting because one of the things that Benjamin makes very clear is that you do not choose your heritage, right? It chooses you. So in a way, he doesn't get to choose the thing he's writing, the thing that's going underneath. It's just something that he has to deal with. He has to embrace something he hasn't chosen. And I think that's also important, right? You don't get to choose the place you come from and your inheritance and your, you are embedded in that tradition. Then you fight it, but that's not a choice.
That's really interesting because I'm thinking here of Fred Moten and Harney's collaboration as two other Marxist-oriented pairs like yourselves.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think they say is that the heritage of the Black radical tradition is the heritage of what it means to be a Marxist in the United States. And I think that that's absolutely true. And it is a tragedy that the image of George Floyd is being degraded by the popular conservative reactionary movement, all of these things that are going on about the legacy. And it is evident to me that the Floyd uprising was a true, it was a true event in some,
Absolutely.
however we,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
And I don't mean that in any mystical idea or anything like that. I mean, I'm sympathetic to Western Marxism, but I think some of Western Marxism, especially the French Nietzscheans, can really become quite. I'm thinking here of Bataille and things of this nature.
Yeah.
But what do you maybe in our conclusion here? Let's open up DuBois and the legacy of the Floyd uprising. How are you thinking about this currently in the wake of the publication of Politically Read? I mean, a lot of things that people don't realize is when you write a book about politics, and I know this myself, having written a couple, where you're trying to make a contribution to the contemporary conjecture. Every month that passes after its publication, you also see things differently. Things become more clear about what you wrote and things of this nature. Yeah. How are you thinking about this text, Politically Read, now? How are you thinking about it? Because this book emerges from a place of a certain optimism. I don't know if that's the right word. I know you talk a lot about Benjaminian pessimism. There's also a fair amount of optimism in your text. Is that still there? Am I wrong to say that? How are you thinking about the text now?
I mean, is it kind of text? Okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's fine.
No, go ahead.
No, I would call it more of like unorganized pessimism, right? Which is the Benjaminian rewrite of what hope might mean, hoping hopelessness. So it is definitely not optimism. It's organized pessimism, which is what Marxism basically is, right? I think we basically, and we weren't aware we were doing that. We followed the text as if we were following some sort of like underground structure that was emerging as we were writing. But what was very clear early on is that this book was meant to be a resource. Was meant to be a resource at a sort of an archive that was incomplete and that was calling for more work. So if this book is to be something, what it actually tells you is keep reading, keep working on this. There's a lot of work to be done. You have to join it, right? So it is a book that never meant to be completely, it doesn't cover everything. It points to a lot of things that we don't go into. It just tells you what happens when you actually do the labor of reading and study seriously, how deep you can go and what the consequences are. So basically it's one way of doing it, but it's calling into being many other ways of doing it. For instance, you mentioned that we have pictures and we have epigraphs. We have those as a sort of way to create a sort of triangulation of text, epigraph, and image. We don't even discuss it. It's about having that as a prompt for further thinking. So I think the idea that what we're coming up is a resource is what was actually keeping us going, because it was a moment where there was a dearth of vocabulary, political vocabulary. We felt there was a lot of antagonism that was unproductive. It's that if there is something about this archive, this is a very generous archive. This is not us. The archive is generous. The archive has a lot to give, but it requires time and labor and a certain kind of a certain willingness to spend time infinite, right? We can give each other is only time. That's the only thing we have. So this archive requires time, attention, the ability to listen, the desire to listen. And that is what the book is about. The idea of this book is that the outcome of it would be more books, more reading, a deeper understanding of these archives that we assume have been completely disclosed and finished. An understanding of how much labor there is in front of us.
And we try to demonstrate that in relation to each one of the figures that we've read. And since you evoked both Fred, who's of course one of our interlocutors, and then DuBois, I wouldn't restrict, as Fred and Stefan do in the quote that you reference, this to an American context, right? I mean, DuBois was an international figure. I mean, he was talking about international Marxism. Black Reconstruction is published in a very particular moment in the mid-30s, the rise of fascism, etc. So that it also is a resource for reading the contemporary moment. And since we're in the mode of closing the discussion, and we close the book with a reading of Marx's ethnological notebooks, right, which were the last thing that he's working on, 1879, 1882. The last thing he's working on is effectively his will and testament. It's what he bequeaths to us. And as Sara mentioned earlier, what he's doing is he's recording excerpts, drawing excerpts of things that he's reading on indigenous communal forms all around the globe. Right, which is kind of an extraordinary thing. Like at the end of his life, what he's looking for are different possibilities for communal forms. And what he realizes is that there are a lot of possibilities. So if there were a lot of possibilities, it didn't have to, the world didn't have to unfold in a capital way, which means it didn't have to begin in a capital way with originary accumulation, etc. That it could have begun differently. So by the time you read the book, what it's suggesting, a la Marx, is that to be communist means to be able to imagine different beginnings and different endings, right? And this is an utterly gorgeous, I think, ending in terms of thinking about it. But I think that Sara is right. I mean, what we were doing is we're performing a series of readings with these comrades on the shelf as resources for doing political work. And our book is one more in this collection of books, in what we're calling a red commonwealth, this commonwealth of resources that we all have that we can draw from in order to do political work in the present. I agree with Sara that it's a book that is about organized pessimism, which is a very technical term in Benjamin, but it is something that still retains, let's say, a relation to the hope that can come from utter hopelessness and a sense of defeat. But as Luxembourg says, there is never a final defeat. Right? There is no final defeat ever.
Yeah, for me, I'm very influenced by Alain Badiou in these questions of revolutionary enthusiasm, and even Jean-Paul Sartre in Critique of Dialectical Reason pinpoints the great revolutionary tradition as one of bound up with enthusiasm, bound up with optimism. But I think that this idea of organized pessimism has some relationality to optimism, but it rejects the dualism between the two, perhaps. Anyway,
we substitute
to a kind of wonder at the world.
Right.
I mean, you see Marx at the end of his life, he still retains an absolute wonder at the world, right? Which is part of being communist.
Right. So I think that imagining different beginnings and different ends can only function if you're able to be surprised and feel wonder. So wonder would be an essential revolutionary, characteristic. It's the ability.
Now we've returned to Aristotle somehow in some kind of original philosophical account of the human.
Right.
Well, this has been a tour de force, if I don't say so myself. I think this has been a great exchange. I want to thank you both for your time. I want to once again show the book here. A very readable text, very much in the spirit of what we do with our study groups. I think I mentioned before we spoke, so many movements in political history started modestly as study groups of inquiry and so on.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for coming on, and please
hopefully
And
we'll
let us
have you back.
extend our thanks to you and to everyone who's listening. This is a great opportunity for us to talk about this and also talk about things that mean a lot to us. I also want to thank Sara for the wonder of the collaboration.
Yeah, I feel the same way, and it's a collaboration that all it wants to do is to be shared. So we want more collaborators. We want more Conrads on the shelf, reading and writing. So it is a call for many others to do the same thing.
Thank you, Daniel.
My pleasure,
Thank
my
you so
honor.
much, Daniel. It's been a
Eduardo, we
pleasure.
will have you back. We'll have you back. And Sara, we hope to have you back, especially first, perhaps, to talk about Emerson in your
Okay.
analysis.
Great.
But until next time, folks, thank you very much.